Good morning. It's so wonderful to be here this morning and to know that this is the second day of Support After Abortion's Healing Conference. This is my first time speaking at the conference. I'm really excited to be here. It's wonderful to think about the mission of the organization to end the demand for abortion through healing people impacted by abortion. I myself have been in the field since 1984. It's hard to believe that when we're talking about what has been done in the past, yesterday, and what needs to happen in the future in terms of abortion healing, that it's been so many years since 1984 that I've been in this work. In fact, I remember going to a conference about 10 years ago. We had a workshop that was titled 40 years in post-abortion healing since the abortion became legal in 1973. And now here we are almost 10 years later, and it just seems like yesterday. So I am excited to be with you. I have a lot of information to provide for you. I'm excited that you'll be able to take away a lot of new information. I have a full program today, so it's going to be limited time for questions. If there is time, I'll definitely give you the opportunity for questions. You can always submit your questions later. And so we'll just kind of get started. So you kind of know who I am. I'm a therapist, director of Southwest Florida Christian Counseling. I consider myself a trauma therapist. About half of my caseload is trauma or PTSD, and the other half of the caseload that I work with is actually sexual addiction. So about 50% of my caseload are working with men who come in for sexual addiction, and the other half is working with PTSD and trauma. I'll be talking more about how I'm able to reach men in abortion through the presenting problem of sexual addiction when they come into my office. Okay, so we're going to get started, and this is kind of a little bit of a joke of the day in the life of my day, and oftentimes people ask me, what's it like to be a trauma therapist? And I say, well, what it's like is someone's always mad at me. And so you can see when people have trauma, they're very reactive, and oftentimes not only with each other, but when they come into the counseling office. And they actually may be like this, and this is what I call the fight or flight. And oftentimes you see this with couples when they're escalating in their arguments, and sometimes they actually end up out of my counseling office, and it's a little bit shocking at times. But I want you to think about this in terms of what happens to a man or a woman once they find out that they're pregnant, in terms of the fight or flight response to finding out they're in a crisis pregnancy. Okay, in terms of my objectives for today for my presentation, there's basically three. The first one is to better understand the crisis of the abortion decision through a trauma lens and the impact it has in making that decision. And to understand that legitimizing abortion as a possible trauma that can cause PTSD symptoms will require it to be treated from an evidence-based practice model, or else we'll risk another 40, or I'll just say 50 years of talk nullifying the very thing that we're trying to achieve. In other words, if we do not start producing programs that treat abortion-related trauma with evidence-based practice, we will not be respected from the mental health field. It will be marginalized in terms of what we're trying to do to help people. And so this has been one of my goals is in the mental health work is to try to get more providers to provide evidence-based practice for abortion trauma. And then thirdly, to be able to apply what you learned and help in the healing process with clients in either a crisis pregnancy or in a post-abortion healing program. So as I go through my presentation, there'll be little places on my presentation that says a takeaway. And I want you to just kind of take some time to write those takeaways down. Those are really important things that I want you to take away from my presentation. There'll probably be about 5 or 10 of them. and you'll just see the little takeaway sign as I go through my presentation. So I want to start off with a little education about the brain. It's important to kind of understand how the brain operates. First, you have the prefrontal cortex or the left brain, and this is the executive functioning of the brain or the rational part of the brain. This part of the brain has very little activity when a woman or man finds themselves in a crisis pregnancy. It is the right brain oftentimes that is more active in that crisis pregnancy, and that's more affecting the emotions and the creative side of the brain. Of course, we know the limbic system is part of what happens in the brain when there's trauma. And basically with PTSD, that part of the brain gets stuck on, and that's part of what PTSD is the brain begins to think that the trauma continues to happen over and over. And then the brainstem basically is when we look at breathing and heart rate. When you're doing trauma work, if you're going to do trauma work with people that have had abortion or with those that are in a crisis pregnancy, you have to think about doing the brainstem work first. In other words, the breathing, the heart rate, you have to look at it from a body approach first. If you're going to help calm down the nervous system of the right brain in order for them to be able to make a rational decision and not a decision out of their right brain. I find these are interesting statistics. We know in the pro-life world that most of the abortions in terms of numbers, they come in the age group from 20 to 24. Look at 33% of all abortions. In my sex addiction work, what you'll find interesting is the recent research shows that the highest age group use of porn is between 18 and 24. What I'm going to suggest to you is we have, because of the incidence of porn use among our young people, there's going to be an increase in crisis pregnancies just because of how the porn use could lead to more high-risky sexual behavior and oftentimes then lead to the risk of an abortion. In my work with men who come into my counseling clinic with a sexual addiction, what I did is about 15 years ago, I started asking the question, had they had an abortion in their history? And what I found is about 25% of those that had sex addiction that came to my office had an abortion in their history, and most of them have never talked about it. So a lot of my work over the years has been trying to kind of look at correlating the risk of sexual addiction with a past abortion in a man's history that they haven't dealt with. I find it interesting at that bottom part there where it says the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed at the age of 25. And how can we expect a man or woman to make a rational decision when they're in the crisis pregnancy, especially when most of the abortions happen in that age group? So as I talk about the brain, I'll be referring to the rational as the left side and the emotional as the right side. Here's a takeaway this is one of my first takeaways I want you to look at, is the right, and I'm gonna just emphasize right, is the right to have an abortion, the right to choose, the right to your body, all come out of a right brain reaction. So when we look at the pro-choice world, in terms of the rights for a woman's body, the right to choose, we have to think about those thoughts and reactions are coming out of a right place in their brain that's often reactive because of previous trauma. We are not going to convince the pro-choice world that abortion is traumatic from a left brain perspective, because most of those people in that work are coming from a right brain reactivity. So another takeaway then is that left brain logic will rarely change a person's mind regarding the right to choose or whether to have an abortion. It usually pushes them toward it. We look to the Bible for evidence of right brain involvement. We know David committed adultery, and he was a man that was really after God. And when I read these scriptures, I want you to think of the heart. When God speaks of the heart, I want you to think of the heart as the right brain. So if you change the words of the scripture, search me, O God, and know my right brain, try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there's any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now, if you read anything about David in the Psalms, we know he probably had PTSD. He was acting out of his right brain, most likely, and doing behaviors. And then once his right brain calmed down, he had a lot of regret for what he did. And then we have Paul in Romans says that I don't really understand myself, for what I want to do is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. Now, oftentimes I use this scripture when I'm working with my addict clients. And what's happening in here is I really think Paul is saying there's something in my right brain that's driving my behavior that my left brain knowledge of God can't seem to stop. And so we know throughout scriptures, there's examples of where the right brain has had more control over human behavior than the knowledge of God. And I always think Jesus was a perfect trauma therapist. He came to heal the brokenhearted and set the captives free. And so, how I kind of changed the wording of that is Jesus came to heal the right brain where trauma is stored and set the captives free from their trauma. And so, if you think of that in a compassionate way, and Jesus came to heal those traumatized people. And he used it through right brain activities with people, so story and parables. And what we know is that the statistics in the church for abortion, addiction, divorce, affairs are no different than in the church and out of the church. And so my hypothesis here of the why is that perhaps church ministry needs to figure out how to heal the brokenhearted in the pews through a right brain approach where people's trauma is stored, or they risk little heart change from a left brain teaching and preaching model that doesn't work for a traumatized congregation. The world will continue to see the church and a relationship to God as a non-deterrent to the very same sins that they commit. So I think the model of church has to be different if we're going to reach those traumatized in the congregation, and we're going to expect that their behavior is somehow going to change. I want to talk about fight or flight. When a client finds out, or when one of my clients finds out they're pregnant, they oftentimes find themselves in a fight or flight response. That means they need to do something quick, which is why a lot of people choose abortion after they find out they're pregnant fairly quickly. They have a hard time not acting on their fight or flight. Oftentimes it's the flight, and the flight is getting to the abortion clinic for the abortion. They also might be fighting their partner over what happened with the crisis pregnancy. So it's a fight with their partner and it's a flight to the abortion clinic. We know the fight or flight response is a very instinctual response anytime people go through trauma. And when we had Hurricane Irma here in Florida, we saw the perfect example of everybody's waiting for this hurricane for a couple of weeks, and the highways got clogged, the gas stations were closed, people were fighting at the gas stations, and people were flighting in their cars. We know this is a natural response to trauma. We saw this during 9/11. What was interesting during 9/11 is the incidences of PTSD was very low. If you look at the research, there was 5% of those interviewed had only PTSD. What they found is the reason it was so low is those people that were running from 9/11 had the ability to act on their fight or flight. They were not trapped. And this is the opposite of what happens to a woman once she goes into an abortion procedure. She is unable to run and she's trapped, which is why the PTSD symptoms go up. What they found in Hurricane Katrina was the actual PTSD symptoms were as high as 33%. The reason is they took the people from their homes in Louisiana, they strapped them to stretchers, they put them on airplanes, and they took them away, and they felt trapped. And so what we know from research now is if we're going to help someone that's going through a crisis pregnancy or after they've had the abortion, we need to look at how their body is responding to feeling trapped, not only in the crisis pregnancy, but afterwards. I call this the inhibited fight or flight at the abortion clinic. This is a terrible thing. If you understand trauma to the degree that I understand trauma, this is probably a major takeaway for everybody listening, is the male is not able to act on his fight or flight response or fight response to protect his partner. So while he's sitting in the abortion clinic, he is unable to act on that natural response. And the female is not able to act on her flight response. So she can't get off the table and run out of the building and say, no, this is not going to happen. When those two people walk out of the abortion clinic together, if you look at their eyes, something terrible happened. What that thing that is terrible that happened is how they were wired under trauma. They were not able to act on it. That's why the damage is so deep for the male and the female. And as part of the healing program, we're working with men and women who were not able to act on their fight or flight at the abortion clinic. We need to work on their body, and we'll talk more about that later. I think one of the worst things that could have happened in our country in terms of trauma was the lockdown. Now, there's a lot of controversy. Was the lockdown helpful? Was it not? Did it help our kids? Did it not? Well, let me tell you, if you understand anything about trauma and anything that I'm telling you today, the worst thing that we can do with people that have trauma is to lock them down, put them in a place they can't get out, and be close to the people they're having trauma with. What we saw was domestic violence rates went up, suicide rates went up, divorce went up, addictions went up. So we need to really look at these decisions that are made by our country. So a little education around PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a mental health condition. It's oftentimes diagnosed when there's exposure to a traumatic event, which involves actual or threatened death. Now, I'm going to challenge this diagnosis in the way that when I'm working with spouses of sex addicts and they find out their husband's been acting out on their addiction, they will meet the full criteria for PTSD. So the criteria for PTSD needs to be changed. It's not just if someone is exposed to a threatened death or actual death. It's any traumatic experience can create PTSD. Now I want you to look at the bottom part there where it says the factors that contribute to the risk of PTSD are immobilization and fear. So that goes back to when a woman's in an abortion clinic, she is experiencing the same kind of trauma if she was being raped. She's not able to get off the table and she's in a state of fear. And that's the worst kind of trauma. We know from history that the term post-abortion syndrome was developed by Vincent Roux in 1981. He went before Congress and he suggested the term. It was only put in the DSM for a very short period of time. It was taken out. And it's never been widely accepted in the community outside the pro-life movement. So I would suggest, please refrain from using the word post-abortion syndrome. I know a lot of you have stopped using it, but since I've been doing this since 1984, that was a very common thing to say. And nobody outside the pro-life movement will respect the work that you do if it's not a legitimate diagnosis. So we just need to take that out of our language. So I'm going to take you through the journey of the crisis of making the choice for abortion that oftentimes a man and a woman go through. So again, when we look at the brain, the choice, the person that's in trauma to abort and how the limbic system seeks relief from the crisis is not unlike the process an addict goes through when seeking relief from their emotional pain. The prefrontal cortex, or the left brain, decreases in activity, and the primary focus being on soothing the cry of relief from the limbic system. So, what we know is when a woman's in a crisis pregnancy, or a man is in the midst of his addiction, the same thing's happening in the brain. The left brain's going offline, the right brain's taking over, and there's very little left brain control. Now, people always oftentimes ask me, how did we get to this place in our country where abortion would be legal and it would be okay for people to do? Oftentimes, I'll do a whole workshop on this, and so I'm just going to touch on this very briefly. This is very important when you're working with clients, learning how to forgive themselves, and they're asking them the question, how could we as an individual and how can we as a country have ever gotten to the place where abortion could be okay? If you look at social psychology, there's quite a few experiments that were done on human beings. What those experiments showed is that if we listen to authority, and the authority is telling us that it's going to be okay, that most people will go beyond their moral code, their moral compass, because their authority that they trust is telling them it'll be okay. And what we also found in a lot of the other experiments is we can get people to do things that goes beyond their moral compass by just conditioning them to be desensitized to what they're really doing. And so as we work with our clients, we need to be able to communicate to them, hey, I understand how you got to this place in our country based on social psychology, that there's a reason why you were able to make that decision. And now that you have your rational mind, you're in a different place. Now, if we can condition our soldiers to kill using video games, by the way, we do, before we send our soldiers to war, we put them in simulators. We can condition a country to kill through abortion. So I want you to think about this, is if we're sending our soldiers to war, and then when we want them to not feel the effects of killing, and we put them in a video game over and over again, our country deconditions our brain to be able to get to the place where once we're in a crisis pregnancy, that we're going to be able to make that choice without having much moral compass at that point. So the process that we go through that leads up to the choice to have an abortion in our country is very similar to the process that soldiers go through in order to make the choice to do what they do in a war. It's not until the conditioning process comes to a stop. Then the right brain trauma memories kick in, and the rational left brain tries to figure out, how did one get to the place where they could do what they did? How could I have got to the place where I murdered hundreds of people in Afghanistan? How could I have got to the place where I went to the abortion clinic and had an abortion? Well, what we know is conditioning is very powerful. Again, when we're helping our clients try to work through forgiveness and grace, we need to help them see that this conditioning process is very powerful. This was Emily Letts. She filmed her abortion, and what I found interesting is she is pro-choice, and she wrote this from being caught off guard about being pregnant. She says, the moment when a woman looks down and sees those two pink lines, and she's not expecting to see them, it's like time implodes and explodes simultaneously. You're caught in this tornado that just sucks out the breath in your lungs. Now, you talk about a good description of a pro-choice person that's filming her an abortion that's going through trauma that she's not even fully aware of. And then she says this, it will always be a special memory for me. I still have my sonogram. And if my apartment were to catch fire, it will be the first thing I grab. Now, this is not a shocking thing to me. I've had many pro-choice clients over the years that have come in for treatment because of the trauma they've experienced, but they will still tell me, even the trauma that they've experienced, that they want to still have the choice. So that's very interesting. Now, for the shock that the man goes through, Arthur Shostak, he was one of the first persons to study men and abortion, and he did thousands of interviews in abortion clinics in the 1980s. And what he found was that men said that when they were in the abortion clinic, it was the worst thing that they ever experienced, and they would never ever want to be back there again. Now, our culture is unable oftentimes to see men in this way, that they care, they have empathy for their partner, and it's traumatic for them. We don't see this much in our culture. But I love this quote by Arthur Shostak. He says, one of the largest shocks that sexually active young men encounter is the shock that comes from hearing their sex partner say, the test is back and we're pregnant, and I'm going to have an abortion. I call this the longest run sentence in the English language, and one of the most painful. It brings information at the start of the sentence, and it brings a decision near the end. But it usually ends with the equivalent question mark because it's a test of a probe. She wants to know, what do you think? Now the guy has just been hit with a lightning bolt, and what he thinks is, I just been hit with a lightning bolt. But usually the response is whatever you want. So we find that a lot of men, because it's traumatic, they end up acquiescing in the decision. So many men and women have experienced previous trauma as a child, and that trauma has a direct impact on their ability to make a rational decision upon finding out they are pregnant. So when we work with people in a crisis pregnancy, we have to look at what previous trauma has this person had. Their response is often a limbic system response rooted in and often triggered by those past fears and attachment belief systems that are oftentimes unconscious. The rational prefrontal cortex kicks back in post-abortion. So the left brain kicks back in, and then there's the regret stage, and then the relief stage is ever so brief for the limbic system. And then both men and women will ask, how could I have done this? I say this for the abortion decision for the male often comes like this. When you see that picture with his eyes like in a deer's caught in headlights, I see these guys in my office. When they tell me about when they found out their partner was pregnant, their eyes are still like that. So that means they're stuck in their trauma. Our eyes tend to show the level of PTSD. And so when a guy finds out, he said, from his partner, I'm pregnant, there's the shock, the deer in the headlights. Oftentimes, if this male has previous trauma, he's being triggered and caught off guard. His nervous system gets aroused. He starts reliving his previous PTSD from childhood. And now he has little ability to be rational and empathetic. And he goes into his fight and flight response. These are just some statistics in terms of how we live in a traumatized nation. We have trauma throughout our country on a major degree level in almost all areas. And I'm just kind of go through these. And these statistics, 1/3 of children will grow up with a father in the home, 1/3 of females will be sexually abused by 18, 1/5 of males, divorce rate, and of course the number of abortions. The point I'm trying to making here is because we have so much other traumas that are happening in our lives, we have to look at those pre-existing traumas as a risk factor for a future abortion decision. And if we look at the way the brain is, the left diagram there of the brain is a functioning brain without PTSD. The right side is a scan of the brain with PTSD. So we have to understand that when we meet a client that's in a crisis pregnancy and they've had previous PTSD, their brain is not functioning very well. And so we have to be really aware of that information and be able to use it. So how do we help people at that point of the crisis? Again, remember my clients, they're in a fight or flight. So we have to calm them down. We have to get to their heart rate and their breathing. Allow the client to act on their fight or flight. Don't inhibit it. Let them walk. Let them take some time to think. Try considering massage and ways to relax their body. And then suggest ways to calm their right brain through music and water and meditation. What we're trying to do is relax the right brain in the fight or flight response long enough to where they can come out of that stage where they can make a rational decision about their child. Because oftentimes the abortion appointment is made prior to any kind of rational ability in terms of decision. So the actual final choice of the abortion, we know that men are a big influence in terms of women's decision about whether to keep their child. And here's 5 different ways that men are involved. They either encouraged or supported the woman, they pressured the woman to abort, or they abandoned her in the decision, or they unsuccessfully opposed the abortion or learned about it after it happened. And let me just tell you this, and all the men that I've worked with probably 300 post-abortive men over the years. When they learn about it after it's happened, it does the most damage, and you can just imagine what happens to a man. What we know based on research is men have a huge influence over whether a woman's going to keep the child. In a study, 80% of females who had abortions report that if they would have had a supportive partner in keeping their child, they would have not had the abortion. So what we know, men have a huge role. If we're looking at 80% of those decisions were impacted by a male. What we have to do is look at why are women so affected by men in terms of the decision. As I began to kind of pull away a little bit of the layers with women, what I found was the abortion decision for the female is oftentimes the result of divorce and absent fathers. It starts off with a lack of healthy nurture from a father. They begin to lose themselves. They begin to have codependency where other feelings are more important and value comes from the outside. They begin to believe that sex equals love. And then the crisis pregnancy happens and they put the male's feelings more important than their own. They choose the security of the relationship over their child, and then they choose the abortion. So my question is, and this is a serious question to think about, is the need to be loved and not abandoned at the crisis point of a pregnancy a greater determining factor in the choice, even when going against moral and religious belief? This is especially true when many men have been abandoned early in life. For example, divorce, abuse, and attachment issues. This is very similar process where people choose addiction over what is rationally good, like taking care of their children. So what I'm suggesting is that this abandonment issue that's deep within a person in the right brain prior to words in the first 2 years of a child's life can be a greater determining factor over the choice to abort than everything the left brain knows about their religious beliefs or what's morally good or not good. And so a huge takeaway is early attachment trauma is one of the greatest psychological risk factors in the abortion choice, period. If we're going to change the rate of abortion in our country, we got to do a better job at looking at those first couple years of a child's life. And I think one of the greatest things that we could do in terms of like future work is the pro-life world needs to begin to invest in parenting programs focused on early attachment. So what we know is those first 2 years are going to have the greatest impact impact on the choice of a female in an abortion, in a crisis pregnancy. So we know we need to do better at parenting programs. Then once the woman makes the choice, what can we do to help her? First, we need to realize that the first 2 years of a child's life, where security of attachment is formed, is the majority of the right brain development. They have very little left brain development until age 2. So when the limbic system is triggered as an adult in a crisis pregnancy, the same concept of soothing can be used that a parent uses to soothe a child. In other words, our greatest ability to stop a crisis pregnancy is we need to provide for those women in a crisis pregnancy and men the same thing that a parent would give the child when they're in a panic in terms of that part of their brain. What we don't want to do is historically, as you see, there were left brain approaches that actually made those that were in a crisis pregnancy be triggered more. These were logical left brain questions. Do you know what the Bible says? Do you realize that a real life is in you? Abortion is murder, pictures of dead babies. All these things were left brain, and they were also causing more trauma and not working. They were actually sending the person to the other way and more at risk of a crisis pregnancy or more at risk of an abortion. Planned Parenthood, what they try to do is they try to lure those that are in a crisis pregnancy in the area of attachment through those first couple years of a child's life by saying, we're going to create a safe place, you're welcome here, we care. And oftentimes that's a very inviting thing when a woman's in a crisis pregnancy. So what we want to do with clients that are in that moment of crisis, we want to mirror their fears as a parent would mirror a child's fears. We want to validate them and show understanding. We want to express empathy, and we want to use attachment language that soothes their trauma. You're in a safe place. We're here for you. We're not going to abandon you. And don't ask questions and limit to the rational discussion. And then try to get a client to follow up with you so for future meetings, so that you have more time to help them not go back into that crisis place in their right brain. Okay. I believe as a mental health worker that we have failed the system in terms of helping those that have had abortions heal in a mental health clinic. We should be the mental health clinicians should be the primary providers, and the paraprofessionals should be the support providers. But what I want to say is you have served a very important role. The mental health world dropped the bomb regarding this issue ever since 1973. And you guys have done tremendous work. And as we talked yesterday in some of the workshops, what we've done in the last 50 years, there's been a lot of great things, but we need to make changes. And it's going to be hard to measure the impact and the healing that has taken place because of your work. But until the mental health world moves into that role, those on the front lines of pro-life work will continue to be the primary care model versus an adjunct care model. In other words, it's my hope that the mental health world will become more the primary caretakers of treating abortion-related trauma. So we need to have a new movement toward getting mental health providers to take over the primary care provider role for abortion trauma. And this is kind of just a statement that I wrote up and want you to think about. Would we send cancer patients as their primary care to support groups and retreats, or would we use the support group as an adjunct to care? Wouldn't the medical world be the ones that needed to take over the primary care for a cancer patient? Would the medical world ever believe that smoking causes cancer if a lot of the research and treatment was primarily being done by conservative religious groups? It is no wonder that the American Psychological Association has no respect for the work we do when we say abortion causes trauma. So another takeaway, if we're going to say abortion can be traumatic and cause PTSD symptoms, then we better treat it in a professional way with evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice basically says there are approaches to prevention or treatment that are based on theory and have undergone scientific evaluation. And the evidence-based stands in contrast to approaches that are based on tradition, convention, belief, or anecdotal research or evidence. Priscilla Coleman had this quote, and this was from some of the research that she did. She says, there are excellent faith-based therapies for women seeking help after abortion. However, the lack of empirically validated treatment protocols in the mainstream indirectly affirms the position of the APA and other professional organizations suggesting no harm and leaves many women without hope for relief. An essential future goal is to therefore develop treatment protocols that test and publish the results. And in terms of evidence-based practice, if we say we're going to treat PTSD, we're going to say that abortion causes PTSD, then these are some of the evidence-based practices that are recommended for PTSD. There's some body-based approaches that are kind of somewhat controversial, but what they're finding is quite effective. As a result of my passion, I developed an organization called the American Association of Therapists Treating Abortion-Related Trauma. And it's our goal to legitimize abortion as a potential trauma so that men, women, and couples who have experienced abortion-related trauma will receive the professional mental health services they need. In addition, we are dedicated to applying research to practice. We are committed to developing evidence-based practice treatment models that are grounded in sound psychological theory. It is my goal as a mental health professional that has been in the pro-life work since 1984 to begin to address the mental health world in the Christian counseling world, to not only get on their feet and do something about this, but we have to start providing evidence-based practice models, or the abortion recovery world will be marginalized by the professional therapist world as not treating it with evidence-based practice, and it will not be respected. So just some of my work in the counseling office every day, these are some of the theories that I use in counseling. Earlier, I showed you a picture of the fight or flight response at the abortion clinic. When I have clients that come in that are stuck in their bodies from the abortion trauma, I actually work them through a body-based approach of how to let go of that trauma that they were not able to let go when they had the abortion. And I can talk more about that in other programs or in answering questions that might come in later. And here's just kind of that earlier slide. And a lot of my other healing programs that I do in my work with clients is based on attachment research. When there's an abortion in a person's life, it causes a problem with attachment to themselves, to their partners, and also to their children. So there's a lot of work and attachment that is done in terms of helping people in my counseling office. And empathy is one of the most powerful tools that I've found in working with couples, and understanding this has been huge. And I hope you take this away in your work with women that are struggling with forgiving the male in the crisis pregnancy. Understanding the impact a male's previous trauma has on their response or lack of their brain and limbic system is the greatest asset for the female partner being able to forgive, and also the male being able to forgive himself. So once a woman understands that the person that abandoned them at the abortion clinic or coerced them to have an abortion had previous trauma, and maybe they didn't do it on purpose, maybe that previous trauma caused them to fight or flight, it's a huge asset in the forgiveness process, both for the female, and also then the male. My final conclusion for today is to think we are going to end abortion rationally from a left-brain perspective, we need to think again. The decision to abort and the reactions between the genders in our country come from a limbic system place that is influenced by current and past trauma, and it's not a rational place. So to try to change law or prove that abortion is a trauma to men and women would need to understand that framework. Getting people to change their view of abortion will not happen from a rational prefrontal cortex, fact-based approach. Healing in both the individual and between the genders in our country from previous trauma that's stored in their brains, in the right brain, may be the only way to extinguish the fire that has been burning for many years since 1973 between men and women about this issue. And we need to find ways to connect with those wounded by abortion from a right brain approach so that maybe in that process we can decrease the reactivity between the pro-life and the pro-choice world and somehow come together with a common ground of men and women, whether pro-choice or pro-life, have been experienced oftentimes trauma from abortion. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions and I appreciate you attending my workshop.